before the world drew its modern borders, before nation-states carved up continents with straight lines and cold calculation, before empires learned to fear their own size, there was a tent, a single red tent, pitched on a windswept hill in the highlands of Anatolia. Inside sat a man named Osman. He had no palace, no treasury filled with gold, no navy, no cannon, no title that the great powers of the world would have recognized. He had perhaps 400 horsemen, a dream too large for his circumstances, and a name that would one day be spoken in fear, in reverence, and in mourning across 3 continents. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening right now, tell me your location and the local time in the comments. It is always a comfort to know how many corners of the world come together in these quiet evenings. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Chapter 1. The Dream in the Tent. Origins of the Ottoman State, 1299 to 1360. To understand the Ottomans, you must first understand the world they were born into. And that world was broken. The great Mongol invasions of the 13th century had shattered the Islamic heartland like a hammer against glass. Baghdad, the city of 1,000 years, the jewel of the Abbasid Caliphate, the place where scholars had once translated the entire known world into Arabic, had been burned to the ground in 1258. Its canals ran with ink from destroyed libraries. The streets fell silent. The center of gravity of the Islamic world simply ceased to exist. Into the vacuum that followed drifted countless displaced peoples. Turkic tribes from the steppes of Central Asia, pushed westward by the Mongol tide, spilled into Anatolia, the great peninsula that bridges Asia and Europe. There were dozens of these small tribal states called beyliks. Each had its own chief, its own ambitions, its own territory carved out from the dying Byzantine Empire to the west. Most of them would be forgotten by history within a generation. One would not. The Osmanli tribe, named after their leader, Osman I, controlled a small but strategically placed territory on the northwestern edge of Anatolia, directly bordering Byzantine lands. This was not an accident. Osman understood something that his rivals did not. The Byzantine Empire, once the eastern half of Rome itself, was exhausted. Its great cities were depopulated. Its armies were hollowed out by centuries of civil war. Its frontier was not defended, it was merely watched, by soldiers who had long since stopped believing in what they were guarding. Osman did not attack the Byzantine heartland. He did not need to. He raided. He probed. He absorbed. Small Byzantine towns, unable to receive help from a distant and distracted Constantinople, gradually fell or surrendered. Settlers followed Osman's horsemen. Farmers, craftsmen, merchants, clerics, filling the land that the Byzantines had quietly abandoned. But Osman was more than a raider. He was a builder of loyalty. He welcomed Christians and Jews into his growing territories, asking only that they pay their taxes and keep the peace. He forged alliances through marriage, not only conquest. He created a sense, unusual for the time, that his state was not merely a tribal plunder operation, but something with a future, something worth joining. When Osman died around 1326, he left behind a state that already controlled the city of Bursa, a prosperous Byzantine trading hub that would become the first Ottoman capital. He left behind a tradition of tolerance that would define Ottoman governance for centuries. And he left behind a son named Orhan, who would take everything his father had built and double it. Under Orhan, the Ottomans crossed the Dardanelles into Europe for the first time. It was 1352. It was, though no one knew it yet, one of the most consequential crossings in world history. The Ottomans had arrived in Europe, and they would not leave for nearly 600 years. Chapter 2. The Thunder of Hooves. Murad I and the Making of an Empire, 1360 to 1389. Orhan's son, Murad I, inherited a state and transformed it into a machine. The Ottomans had always relied on cavalry. Fast, mobile, devastating in the open field. But Murad understood that cavalry alone could not hold an empire. Cavalry raids, cavalry plunders, cavalry retreats. What he needed was something that did not retreat. And so he created the Janissaries. The concept was audacious and, by modern standards, deeply troubling. Young Christian boys, taken from their families in the Balkans as a form of tax called the devshirm, or boy collection, were converted to Islam, trained from childhood in the arts of war, educated in Ottoman languages and customs, and forged into the most disciplined infantry force the medieval world had seen. They owed loyalty to no tribe, no family, no homeland, only to the Sultan. They were, in the most literal sense, men who had been remade. And they were extraordinary. Under Murad, the Ottomans swept through the Balkans. Adrianople fell, renamed Edirne. It became the new Ottoman capital, a European city now flying the crescent flag. Bulgaria became a vassal state. Serbian power was broken at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, in a clash so brutal and so defining that Serbs would mourn it as a national wound for the next 600 years. Murad himself did not survive Kosovo. He was assassinated on the battlefield. Accounts differ on exactly how, but the empire he left behind was already too large, too organized, and too powerful to mourn him for long. His son, Bayezid I, took the throne the same day his father died, and he earned, almost immediately, a name that tells you everything about his character. They called him Yildirim, the Thunderbolt. Chapter 3. The Thunderbolt and the Earthquake. Bayezid, Timur and the First Collapse, 1389 to 1413. Bayezid moved with a speed that astonished both his allies and his enemies. He tightened the siege of Constantinople, the great Byzantine capital, still holding on by sheer stubbornness and towering walls, and simultaneously crushed a European crusade at the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396. Crusaders from France, Hungary, England, and the Holy Roman Empire came to push the Ottomans back into Asia. Bayezid annihilated them. He seemed, for a moment, unstoppable. But history has a cruel sense of timing. From the east came a force that even Bayezid could not outrun. Timur, Tamerlane, the Turco-Mongol conqueror who had already burned Delhi, sacked Baghdad, and built pyramids from human skulls across Central Asia, turned his gaze westward. He and Bayezid exchanged increasingly hostile letters. Bayezid, who had never been defeated, responded with characteristic boldness. He insulted Timur. In 1402, at the Battle of Ankara, Timur's forces met the Ottoman army. It was not a battle. It was a humiliation. Ottoman vassals defected mid-fight. The Janissaries were overwhelmed. Bayezid I, Sultan of the Ottomans, conqueror of crusaders, the man who had laid siege to Constantinople, was captured alive. He spent the last months of his life as Timur's prisoner. Some accounts say he was kept in a cage. Others say he was used as a footstool. Whether these stories are true or legend matters less than what they meant. The empire that Osman had built from a tent and 400 horsemen had, in a single afternoon, nearly ceased to exist. What followed was 11 years of civil war between Bayezid's sons. The Ottomans called it the interregnum, the time of no sultan. Brother killed brother. Alliances formed and collapsed within seasons. The Byzantines, the Venetians, and every Balkan principality waited to pick over the bones. But the bones refused to stay still. In 1413, one son emerged victorious. His name was Mehmed I. He gathered the fragments of his father's empire, pressed them back together with iron will and quiet intelligence, and handed a restored state to his son, who would become the most consequential Ottoman ruler of all. Chapter 4: The Conqueror. Mehmed II and the Fall of Constantinople, 1453. Mehmed II became sultan for the first time at the age of 12. His father, Murad II, abdicated in his favor, an experiment in early succession. It did not go well. Rebellions erupted. Murad was called back. Mehmed was set aside. He spent the following years in something between exile and education. He read. He studied military history, philosophy, mathematics. He learned multiple languages. He absorbed the accounts of every siege ever conducted against Constantinople. He was patient in the way that only people with something to prove can be patient, quietly, furiously, completely. When Murad died in 1451 and Mehmed took the throne for the second time, he was 21 years old. Within 2 years, he would do what no Muslim ruler had managed in 8 centuries of trying. The siege of Constantinople in 1453 is one of the great set pieces of history. The city's walls, the Theodosian walls, were among the most formidable fortifications ever built by human hands. They had held for 1,000 years. They had repelled Avars, Arabs, Bulgars, and Russians. They were not merely walls. They were a symbol of Byzantine endurance, of Christian civilization, of the idea that some things simply could not fall. Mehmed brought cannons. Not ordinary cannons. He commissioned a Hungarian engineer named Urban to build the largest bronze bombards the world had ever seen. The largest of them, called the Great Bombard, fired stone balls weighing over half a ton. It took 60 oxen and 400 men to move it, could be fired 7 times a day. And when it fired, the sound was heard from miles away. The walls, which had never been breached, began to crack. The siege lasted 53 days. The defending force, perhaps 7,000 men, some of them Genoese and Venetian volunteers, against an Ottoman army of perhaps 80,000, fought with desperate brilliance. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI, the last emperor of the East, refused every offer of safe passage. He chose to die with his city. On the morning of May 29, 1453, the Ottoman forces poured through a breach in the walls. Constantine XI threw off his imperial regalia and charged into the fighting. His body was never identified. Constantinople had fallen. Mehmed rode into the city that afternoon. He was 21 years old. He went first not to the treasury, not to the palace, but to the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, built by the Emperor Justinian in 537, one of the most magnificent buildings in human history. He knelt in it. He prayed. And then he converted it into a mosque. The world had changed. Everyone who was paying attention understood that. Mehmed II, now called Fatih, the Conqueror, spent the rest of his reign building something worthy of what he had taken. He repopulated Constantinople, bringing in Greeks, Armenians, Jews, and Muslims to restore the city's life. He rebuilt its infrastructure. He transformed it into Istanbul, not erasing what had been, but layering the Ottoman world over the Byzantine one. He was a man of genuine intellectual curiosity, who collected paintings, commissioned histories, and reportedly regretted on his deathbed that he had not done more. He died in 1481, at the age of 49, reportedly on campaign. Some historians suspect poison. He left behind an empire that stretched from the Danube to the Euphrates. And he left behind a capital city that would, within a generation, become the largest city in the Western world. Chapter 5. The Golden Age. Suleiman the Magnificent, 1520 to 1566. Between Mem II and the Golden Age came 3 more sultans, each capable, each expanding the empire's reach. Bayezid II consolidated and reformed. Selim I, brutal and brilliant, turned east and south, defeating the Safavid Persians, conquering Syria, Palestine, and Egypt in a campaign of breathtaking speed. He brought the holy cities of Mecca and Medina under Ottoman protection, transforming the Sultan into the Caliph, the defender of all Sunni Islam. But it was Selim's son who became the face the world remembers. Suleiman I took the throne in 1520 and ruled for 46 years. The Europeans called him magnificent. His own people called him Kenyuni the lawgiver. Both names were accurate. Both fell short. Under Suleiman, the Ottoman Empire reached its greatest territorial extent, stretching from Hungary in the northwest to Yemen in the south, from Algeria in the west to the Persian Gulf in the east. His armies besieged Vienna in 1529, the high-water mark of Ottoman expansion into Europe. His navy, commanded by the legendary Admiral Hayreddin Barbarossa, dominated the Mediterranean. Ottoman ships raided the coasts of Spain, France, and Italy. The Venetians paid tribute. The Holy Roman Emperor negotiated rather than fought. But Suleiman was not only a conqueror. He commissioned the greatest architect of the age, Mimar Sinan, to build structures that would define Ottoman aesthetics forever. The Suleimani Mosque in Istanbul, completed in 1557, was a statement in stone that the Ottoman world was not merely powerful, but beautiful, that it did not only take, it also created. He reformed the legal system, bringing order and consistency to an empire of extraordinary diversity. He wrote poetry, in secret under a pen name. He corresponded with European monarchs as an equal, sometimes as a superior. He also made the decision that would, in ways he could not have foreseen, begin the long unraveling. He fell in love with a woman named Hurrem. She was a slave, almost certainly from what is now Ukraine, purchased as a concubine and given the name Hurrem, the joyful one. She was not supposed to have power. Slaves were not supposed to become legal wives. Concubines were not supposed to outlast their relevance once their sons were grown. None of the rules that were supposed to contain her contained her at all. Suleiman freed her, then married her, the first Ottoman Sultan to legally marry in more than a century. She bore him 6 children. She wrote him letters of extraordinary tenderness. She advised him on politics, on appointments, on the management of rivals. And she convinced him, through means that history has never fully untangled, that his eldest son, Mustafa, born of another woman, was a traitor. Suleiman had Mustafa strangled. The son who might have been the greatest Ottoman Sultan after Suleiman himself died on his father's orders, based on evidence that was almost certainly fabricated by a woman who wanted her own son on the throne. Suleiman lived 11 more years after Mustafa's death. He died in 1566 on campaign in Hungary, in his tent, at the age of 71. His Grand Vizier hid the body for days to prevent the army from losing heart before the siege was concluded. He was buried in Istanbul, in a mausoleum beside his mosque. Hurrem had preceded him in death by 8 years. She is buried nearby. The empire he left behind was, by every measurable standard, at the height of its power. Its treasury was full. Its armies were feared. Its architecture was sublime. Its institutions were functioning. But inside, something had already shifted. Something quiet. Something that would take another century and a half to fully reveal itself. Chapter 6. The Slow Unraveling. Decline without disaster. 1566 to 1683. Empires rarely fall from a single blow. They hollow out, slowly, from within. After Suleiman, the Ottoman Empire entered a period that historians have debated for centuries. Was it decline? Was it transformation? Was it simply the natural plateau after extraordinary expansion? The answer, as with most honest historical questions, is complicated. What changed first was the Sultanate itself. For the first 2 centuries of Ottoman history, sultans had led their armies personally. They had shared hardship with their soldiers, made decisions on the battlefield, and earned loyalty through visible courage. After Suleiman, this tradition faded. Sultans remained in Istanbul, in the Topkapi Palace, increasingly isolated by ceremony and surrounded by competing factions of advisors, mother queens, and janissary commanders, each with their own agenda. The harem, once simply the women's quarters of the palace, became a political institution. A place where mothers of sultans competed with fierce intelligence for control over sons who would inherit the world. Historians call this period the Sultanate of Women, and the name is partly admiring. These were not passive figures. Kozum Sultan, mother of 2 sultans and grandmother of a third, effectively governed the empire for decades. She was strangled in 1651 by palace servants loyal to her own daughter-in-law, who wanted her son's future secured. The Janissaries, meanwhile, had transformed. Once the elite fighting force of the empire, they had become something else entirely. Over the generations, they had been allowed to marry, to enter trades, to pass their positions to their sons. They were no longer warriors first. They were a privileged caste, resistant to any change that threatened their status, capable of deposing sultans who displeased them, and they exercised that capability with alarming frequency. Between 1617 and 1623 alone, for sultans came and went. The empire still fought, still won battles. It still administered vast territories with considerable efficiency. The Second Siege of Vienna in 1683, led by the Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, brought Ottoman armies to the gates of the Habsburg capital, the deepest penetration into Europe in Ottoman history. But Vienna held. A relief army, composed of Polish, Austrian, and German forces under the Polish king John III Sobieski, arrived at the crucial moment. In a single afternoon, the tide turned. Kara Mustafa retreated and was strangled on the Sultan's orders for his failure. The Second Siege of Vienna was the last time the Ottomans threatened the heart of Europe, and almost everyone on both sides sensed it. Chapter 7. The Long Retreat. Reform, Resistance, and the Question of Survival, 1683 to 1839. After Vienna, the empire entered a new and painful phase, learning to lose. Territory that had been Ottoman for generations was surrendered in treaty after treaty. Hungary went. Parts of the Balkans followed. The Black Sea coast, once an Ottoman lake, began to fall under Russian pressure. Russia, in particular, emerged as an existential threat. A vast, modernizing empire to the north, hungry for warm water ports and pushing south with relentless pressure. Some sultans understood what was happening. Selim III, who reigned from 1789 to 1807, looked at the armies of revolutionary France and Napoleonic Europe and recognized that the world had changed in ways that the Ottoman system had not adapted to. He attempted reform, creating a new European-style military force trained by French officers, reorganizing finances, opening the empire to new ideas. The Janissaries had him deposed and killed. His successor tried again. Mahmud II, patient and strategic, spent years preparing his ground. In 1826, he lured the Janissaries into an open revolt, and then destroyed them. Artillery was turned on their barracks in Istanbul. The fires burned for days. Thousands died. Mahmud abolished the Janissary Corps entirely, an institution that had existed for nearly 5 centuries. He called it, with dark Ottoman bureaucratic understatement, the auspicious incident. With the Janissaries gone, reform became possible. European-style schools opened. A modern army was built. Legal codes were rewritten. The telegraph arrived. Newspapers appeared. Young Ottomans began to travel to Paris and London and return with ideas that their empire had no framework to contain. But reform, in a state as vast and diverse as the Ottoman Empire, was never fast enough. And the empire's enemies, internal and external, were not waiting. Greece won its independence in 1830 with European support. Egypt, under the brilliant and ruthless Muhammad Ali, became effectively autonomous, almost conquering Istanbul itself before European powers intervened to protect the Ottomans, not out of affection, but because no European power wanted any other European power to inherit the Ottoman lands. The empire was kept alive, increasingly not by its own strength, but because its death would be too inconvenient for everyone else. This was the Ottoman condition in the 19th century, too weak to stop its losses, too useful to be allowed to collapse entirely. The great powers called it the Eastern Question. For the Ottomans, there was nothing abstract about it. It was the daily reality of governing a shrinking state surrounded by circling rivals. Chapter 8. The End of Worlds. War, Genocide, and the Final Collapse. 1914 to 1922. The 20th century arrived in the Ottoman Empire not as progress, but as catastrophe. By 1908, a group of young military officers, educated in European ideas, furious at the empire's weakness, convinced that only radical action could save what remained, had seized effective power. They called themselves the Committee of Union and Progress. History called them the Young Turks. They dreamed of a modern, strong, unified Ottoman state. They made almost every decision wrong. In 1914, against the advice of older statesmen who understood the empire's fragility, they entered the First World War on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary. They gambled that a German victory would restore Ottoman territories and prestige. The gamble failed catastrophically. What followed was the worst period in Ottoman history. On multiple fronts simultaneously, against Russia in the east, against Britain in Mesopotamia and Palestine, against Allied forces at Gallipoli, the Ottoman armies fought and bled and suffered staggering losses. And in eastern Anatolia, in the chaos and paranoia of total war, the Ottoman leadership made a decision that would define their legacy in the darkest possible terms. The Armenian community, Christian, prosperous, concentrated in the eastern provinces where Russian forces were advancing, was accused of collaboration with the enemy. What followed was systematic. Deportation orders, death marches into the Syrian desert, massacres carried out by irregular forces. Between 600,000 and 1.5 million Armenians died. The exact number is still contested. The fact of mass death is not. It was one of the first genocides of the modern era, and it happened in the dying years of an empire that had, for centuries, been defined by its tolerance of religious diversity. The war ended in 1918 with Ottoman defeat. Allied forces occupied Istanbul. The Sultan signed a humiliating armistice. The empire that had once besieged Vienna was now occupied by foreign soldiers in its own capital. But the story was not quite over. From the ruins emerged a man named Mustafa Kemal, a military officer of extraordinary ability, the hero of Gallipoli, a man of steel nerves and absolute clarity of purpose. He refused to accept the peace terms that would have dismembered Anatolia. He rallied what remained of the Ottoman army. He fought the Greek forces that had landed on the Aegean coast with Allied backing. He won. The Turkish War of Independence ended in 1922 with victory. Mustafa Kemal, who would later take the surname Ataturk, father of the Turks, abolished the Sultanate. The Ottoman Empire, 623 years after Osman pitched his tent on a windswept Anatolian hill, ceased to exist. The last Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed VI, left Istanbul on a British warship on November 17, 1922. He carried with him nothing but a few personal belongings and the weight of a dynasty's end. He died in exile in San Remo, Italy, in 1926. Closing. What do we make of 600 years? Of an empire that began with a dream and 400 horsemen, that built the greatest city in the Western world, that gave shelter to Jews expelled from Spain, to Greeks, to Armenians, to Arabs, to dozens of peoples and faiths under a single administrative roof, that produced architecture of heartbreaking beauty and armies of terrifying efficiency, that, in its final years, committed atrocities it has never fully reckoned with, that collapsed not with a single catastrophic blow, but with the slow, patient pressure of a changing world it could no longer keep pace with. Perhaps the most honest thing we can say is this: the Ottoman Empire was neither the paradise its admirers imagine nor the monster its critics describe. It was a human creation, magnificent, flawed, adaptive, sometimes cruel, sometimes generous, doing what all human creations do, trying to survive. The walls of Topkapi still stand above the Bosphorus. The minarets of the Suleiman Mosque still rise above Istanbul's skyline. In the evening, when the call to prayer drifts across the water and the lights of two continents reflect on the strait that Mehmed crossed in 1453, you can still feel it, that sense of something vast and layered, something that took centuries to build and decades to fall, and that has never quite finished echoing. Osman's tent is long gone, but the name he gave it is still here. Now, as the night settles around you and the story finds its resting place, let this be enough. 600 years in a single evening. An empire in a dream. Rest easy.